you have to understand that there was no plan to become an organization like we currently are. There was really, it started off as a trauma response, which I can now identify, and it kind of grew out from there on its own organically. And so we started off in a very grassroots way. It was more of a feeling than a plan. And so, after George Floyd was killed on May 25th, 2020, I felt really hollow inside. And I felt this really strong, biting need to contribute to the movement in some way. And so when I saw the murals coming up all over the Twin Cities, they really spoke to me because they put language and imagery to emotions that I felt but couldn't name at the time. And I thought it was so important that that be preserved, but I didn't know what that looked like. I'm not a preservationist, I'm not an artist, and I don't have a background in even organizing. And so I think that for me, it started off as a need to help and this response to what I knew would happen if I didn't help, if someone didn't help. I knew that once the murals came down, they would be collected by white institutions like the Minnesota Historical Society or MIA or the Walker even. And that kind of drove me to spring into action. And so the reason that I started collecting the murals is because I didn't want them to be destroyed or colonized. There wasn't much more planning or effort that went into it than that. Just kind of having this gut feeling that I needed to do something, and then writing up some quick flyers and hopping in my Jeep and going door to door to businesses and just learning and trying to figure out what's going to happen to the murals once they're taken down, and whether or not the businesses had a plan or whether or not they'd already spoken to any organizations that had a plan. But it seemed that no one knew what to do in this moment where we were experiencing total chaos in the cities. And so I just decided that I would just take it upon myself and start collecting them and see what happened from there. And so now we've started collecting murals, and I've got a couple hundred murals in my garage. And now I have to figure out what to do with them, because I can't just be the person who collected the murals and didn't do anything with them, because now I'm no better than the institutions that I sought to protect them from, right? And so I decided to do an exhibit to commemorate the 1 year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And I started planning this back in maybe September or October of 2020. And with no experience and very few boards and certainly no funding or resources, I made the decision to curate this exhibit for George, to remember him. But then as we were planning that, I realized that I have to catalog these murals. I have to make sure that I know what we have. I can't curate if I don't know what we have. And really all we had so far was around 300 or 400 something murals, a storage space at the Northrop King building, and not much else. And so then I realized we had to catalog, we had to archive the murals. And before I knew it, we had programming. We had collection, preservation, and archiving. Or no, sorry, collection, preservation, and activation, which are our three pillars. And things just continue to grow out from there. I started consulting with other organizations around the country who were also trying to collect murals. I realized in this field that people don't look like me. And so even though I was able to find this incredible team of archivists, preservationists, catalogers, and museum folk, none of them looked like me. And so the gears just kept turning, and I was like, okay, now we have to have this educational element, because we need to teach people who look like me to do this work so that I'm not alone in this. And, by December, MTM had kind of bloomed and blossomed into this organization. And when we started up in January, we said, okay, moving forward, that's what this is. We're not going to call it a project anymore. We're going to move as if it's an organization and build it into one. So that's how we got started. That's how I founded Memorialize the movement, through a response that grew out of my community's need for something that wasn't already there. We didn't have the infrastructure or the foundation for this. And even though along the way I kept hoping that there would be something, someone, some organization who could take the reins and say, okay, you did great, Leesa, but we got it from here. We do this professionally. I never saw that. It never came along, which is unfortunate. But the silver lining is that now I get to be the one to lay the foundation and build the infrastructure for Black preservation organizations in Minnesota. And so that's huge. But that's where we started. Brent, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I sit here and listen to your beautiful introduction and overview, I have to be honest that this is the first time that I've heard of this organization, and I had no idea about this project, now organization, and the leadership work that you and your colleague sparked by the threat to this living culture and history and memory.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful. And so I just want to start by saying thank you. I love the way that you framed your work. And I was thinking about my recent keynote just a few minutes ago. And I mentioned the National Association of Colored Women, who was under the leadership of Mary Talbert, who at the time was the national president. And in essence, their work, grassroots organizing, would birth the Black preservation movement in the US. So you stand on a beautiful legacy, and you're creating your own legacy and a blueprint for Black preservationists, well, whether newcomers or seasoned
Mm-hmm.
preservationists, to be able to advance this work and to make the work relevant. So you're awesome. And I'm curious, so you've got a lot of murals that you have stored, and what's your dream? Like 10 years from now, what does Memorialize the movement as an organization look like, and what kind of work is it doing in Minnesota? And then what's your vision also for the actual material culture that you've saved from these threats?
Yes, that's a great question. The hope is to, well, the goal actually is to create a permanent space here in Minneapolis. I don't want to call it a museum because I don't want to subscribe to the museum culture that we currently have, like the institution that we currently work within. But I want to create a space for remembrance and reflection and learning. Um, let's call it a cultural center where people can come and see the murals standing upright in full form, along with text and learning materials and workshops and an interactive experience where people can learn, because this is history in the making, in real time. And when you come into our space at the Northrop King building and you see all of these murals, we currently have them stacked upright, like a deck of cards against the wall, just dozens of stacks of boards. And when you come into that space, what you get is a full story. So 10 years from now, 20, 50 years from now, when people ask what happened at the Minneapolis uprising of 2020, I want them to be able to come into this space and reference the boards, read it right there on these beautiful, elaborately painted murals that people created in real-time scribes to express what was happening. You know, when you look around our space, you get the whole story from beginning to end. You get the moment George Floyd was killed, and everyone's reaction, the anger, because the boards were up to protect, the plywood boards were up to protect businesses from looters and protesters and rioters. And so naturally, that response when people saw those murals up, that barrier between them and their anger, and that outlet that they wanted to take to relieve that anger, they started to write on the boards. So you've got people writing, justice for George, F12, prosecute the police, just all of these really expressive phrases and language. And so I think, to answer your question, a space where people can come and they can sit and they can learn. We have tons of history museums all around Minnesota that speak to white history, or, this history or that history, but we have one African American history museum here. It was founded 2 years ago, and it's a rented space. It's a one-room rented space. It can't house the boards. It can't house all of Minnesota's history. We have to create more spaces like that. We have to create spaces for learning just about specific events, not even all of Black history in one museum, But this moment in time, I want to be recognized forever and remembered, because so often with civil rights movements, do they just get swept away? We've got the Montgomery bus boycott and we've got a couple others, but how many have been forgotten because we didn't preserve artifacts and we didn't, record that in real time? And now we've forgotten it because it's easier than remembering and focusing on that time in history where we did something really heinous and we need to learn and grow from it. And so my hope is that we can create that space and we can honor George Floyd's legacy and the legacy of those who came before and after him, while simultaneously continuing this conversation and creating understanding in a way that hopefully leads to change.
I love your vision and the way that you think about this. And when you were talking, I too am inspired by social movements and the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
And a lot of my work in the present is filling the gaps in that history, like Robert's Temple, the Emmett Till story,
Mhm.
um,
Tulsa Massacre.
Tulsa Massacre. Yep. But in Chicago, there's only one building still standing that helps to tell the story of the Black Panther Party movement. And we all know that that history is misunderstood.
Mhm.
And so I think what you are doing is exceptionally important as you continue to talk about education, because not only are we a forgetful society, but we sometimes confuse the truth,
Mhm.
and having this material culture living, existing as a witness to that historical moment and lasting as a record helps to ensure that the truth and that the education is present for future generations.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think that's the driving factor. Actually, I'm glad that you put language to it, because that is the driving factor for me, was not just preserving the boards, but preserving the truth. A couple years back here, at the Walker, I believe, they did an exhibit. It was either the Walker or the Minnesota Institute of Art. They did an exhibit about Philando Castile, his life, his death, and the whole situation surrounding that. And people were outraged because they didn't do it justice. They told the story in a way that didn't honor his life, or, give justice to his death. And I didn't want that to happen to George. And I just couldn't bear to think about people taking this story, our story, that doesn't belong to white people. Yes, they were here. Yes, they were a part of it, but this is our trauma. This is our burden that we carry. And I couldn't bear to think of them taking that story and skewing it in a way
Mhm.
where George Floyd is suddenly the villain in his own murder. And I think that's what really drove the work that I currently do, is just not just wanting to preserve this art or preserve this history, but making sure that his story is told the way it needs to be told. It's not a happy story. It's not a pretty story. It's a hard, hard story to tell. And even though that burden falls on me, I'm going to make sure that every single time I tell it, people walk away angry and uncomfortable, because that's what we need.
I'm loving this. And we're often asking ourselves, and I'm sure Greg has similar conversations with students in your preservation program, but it's who has the authority to define the future of history and to interpret that history. And I just love that you understand your own authority and power
Mm-hmm.
to control the narrative and to ensure that it is accurately depicted both in the present and in the future. And I see your work really as helping preservation to demonstrate its potential,
Mm-hmm.
that preserving a shared tapestry and culture and heritage should be viewed as racial justice and an act of civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful what you're doing.
Thank you. It's not easy. It's hard work, but I will say that I have been blessed to have the resources here in Minnesota that we have. There's a lot of preservationists, conservationists who volunteered their time and their skills to teaching me how to do this work,
Good.
which has been nice. And I think although I've run into some bumps, not many with people, for the most part, people have understood that it's not their place to come in and try and control, but to lend their resources to creating something new, a new system in which Black people can tell their own stories. Indigenous people and Latinx people and Somali people here can tell their own stories. And white people here can lend their resources to helping those stories be told rather than trying to colonize and control that. So it has been really nice. And I think I've lived mostly in the Midwest my entire life, but I definitely feel that if it were going to happen anywhere, this is a good place to start because there are a lot of people who want to help. So,
Lisa, it's so impressive, the work that you're doing. I want to thank you. I wonder if you could share some insights about what you've learned from displaying these boards and collecting them. I imagine you've had all manner of conversations with people and you've observed their reactions to this material. I wonder if you could share some thoughts about that.
yeah, I've learned so much. As someone who came into this with virtually no experience in the field, it's been a constant journey of learning and growing, which is really nice. But I think, like I said, it started off as a reaction, not I didn't start Memorialize movement with intention. And so as I've collected and grown and it's become an organization, I have had to think really hard about what I want to do and what I want to say with this. Like I did it, great. Now what am I going to do now that I have this platform, you know? And so my goal has been to create understanding. Um, that's the main thing. I want people who aren't me to understand what it's like to be me. I want people to understand what it's like to be a Brianna or a George or an Ahmad or a Sandra Bland. And so what I've learned is that using art as this powerful tool to start conversations and elicit emotions from people and kind of propel them into what it's like, even for a second, to be someone like me is really an effective tool for activism and civil rights. Um, One of the things that I've really focused on with Memorialize the Movement is community, because I think that my role in the ecosystem of justice is to get people to understand on a much smaller level. I don't have a large platform, and Minneapolis is obviously not a very big city, and neither is St. Paul. But when I bring people together, I can talk to them. I can make them listen. I can help them understand and contextualize what they're seeing with the murals. And so, one thing that we do is we create a lot of volunteer opportunities where we bring people into our space at the Northrop King building and have them physically moving the murals around. Partially because they're huge. The boards on average are 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and about 50 or 60 pounds, depending on the thickness of the plywood. But also partially because it creates understanding. When we have people coming into the space to reorient, to help us catalog, archive, photograph, or just organize what we have there, people physically have to carry these portraits of George Floyd's face, these messages that say, I can't breathe. We make people carry the murals to a panel because they're heavy. And oftentimes they're mostly strangers who come to volunteer. And so you have these two strangers carrying George Floyd, even if for a couple minutes at a time, and they're understanding that burden, even if for a second, because our space is alive with the spirits of the people who left these powerful messages on the murals. And every time people leave, they understand a little bit. So what I've learned is that it's not going to be, this isn't a large scale, I guess, impactful movement that we're doing with Memorialize the movement. We're trying to reach as many people as possible, but the best way that we reach people is one at a time, two at a time, by having them understand what these murals mean to our community and how they can do better and be better. Yeah.
It's remarkable, Leesa. I wonder if you could say something about, I imagine this work and these conversations, they take a toll on you. And in your bio, you mentioned providing systems of support for other Black, Indigenous, and women of color. I wonder just how you've had to deal with this burden, this weight that you've carried, and what has helped you through those moments.
That's a good question. It has been hard. It has been really hard. Um, you know, when I started this, I didn't understand what I was getting into at all. um, and and realizing the burden that I've put on myself has been difficult because if you were here last summer, you know that it was really electrically charged. A lot of people weren't thinking, they were acting. We weren't planning, we were doing. Everybody was charged up with these really intense emotions, and we needed to release those emotions some way. And whether that was protesting or making art or collecting art or whatever it was, there was just a lot of doing and not a lot of processing what we were doing. And so I would go and I would go and I would go. We were picking up boards at an alarming pace. We had to rent a new space because my garage was filling up so fast. Um, but I wasn't really understanding what I was doing. And so when I would stop and relax, I would just be overcome with grief or whatever emotions I was feeling because I wasn't processing things in real time. I would push it all aside, push it deep down just to do the work. And then when I had a moment to breathe, I'd just be overcome with emotion and overwhelmed by them and just unable to function, unable to take a breath, unable to get out of bed sometimes. And it has been really hard because this is not easy work, especially for a Black woman to be doing. The more I've done this work, the more I've learned about George and the others before and after him. And I feel like I'm carrying them with me all the time. I feel like when I'm doing this work, I'm always thinking about how I'm going to honor them and make them proud. I'm also trying to prevent more. Like, if I can just reach this one person, or if I can reach this one group of people, maybe they'll prevent the next cop from doing this to someone else. There's this tremendous burden that you take on when you're doing organizing and activist work. But I have been fortunate to have a wonderful system of Black women to care for me doing this work. People who aren't necessarily on the ground or organizing, but they've created these systems or these places for me, just for me, where I can go when I'm not organizing, when I'm not doing activist work, and I can just breathe. There's this place called Render Free. It's actually just down the street from my house, and it's a Black woman-owned workspace and safe haven. It's just a really beautiful lounge that has an area with computers and desks where you can do work. And you can go there and you can cry, you can take a nap, you can be fed, or you can talk to somebody. There are women there who are just waiting for someone to come in who is having a particularly bad day, and you can just talk and, unload yourself, and then you can leave. There's another place called Face of Layla's. It's a Black woman owned salon and spa, and she just physically cares for you. And she'll let you talk while you're getting a facial or a massage or whatever. She'll just let you talk and unload yourself and your emotions. And so these places that I've found have been, instrumental in me doing this work, because on the days that I have off, I haven't been able to process. But now I have these safe places where I can go and just be surrounded by women who look like me, who know what I'm going through, and who have tailored their services around caring for me. So I've been strengthened by their love and their care. And anytime I feel overwhelmed, I just go see one of them. I'm seeing a Black therapist who is really incredible and patient with me. I'm seeing a chiropractor and an acupuncturist, and just like really taking time, carving out time to care for myself with these women. Um, and that's what kind of keeps me going.
Thanks so much for sharing that
Hmm.
vulnerability with us, Leesa. It's really moving. It's been pretty well documented by scholars that most historic properties in the United States, officially designated ones, but they acknowledge a more or less celebratory history of progress and achievement. And I recognize that the work that you are doing, and I imagine I wanted to direct this question to Brent. Um, Many African American historic sites of significance have a different tone and tenor and history to them. I wonder if Brent, if what Leesa is saying is familiar to you as you travel the country and you talk to other people of color working to preserve sites of significance to people of color.
Yeah, what you're describing is accurate and a shared experience. The trauma of preservation activism is real. And fortunately, Leesa is experiencing that trauma now and managing that trauma. Preservation projects take decades, oftentimes, and that's just to designate, protect, and to restore
Hmm.
the artifacts. It's not even the long work of sustaining an organization and doing, the public programming, public engagement. And so it's really difficult to advocate on behalf of this history and sustain the energy, especially given the trauma that Black preservationists and communities have experienced. When Leesa was talking and describing her trauma, I was thinking about the Atlantic magazine article that came out recently. It was the second for the Inheritance Project, and it was about Tulsa and the racial massacre. And the trauma is that the Black preservationists in Tulsa were being denied district designation for sites in Greenwood because of a loss of historic fabric and integrity. And reading that, I better understood that preservation is contributing to the trauma communities by a lack of recognition and inclusion within our historical record. They have since secured designation, which is fantastic, but that story brings to life, and what Leesa just shared, it brings to life the complexity of doing this work and being able to nurture and sustain one's motivation and soul to be able to carry it forward.
Leesa, I wonder if you could say more about the type of help that you've received from people maybe in the preservation community and beyond, and the type of help that you still need and that you're looking for.
Yeah, definitely. Um, well, most of the help that we've received has been around archiving and the preservation of the murals. We're working with the Midwest Art Conservation Center. We have a wonderful conservationist, Melissa, who comes into the space and will help us to assess the condition of the murals. And so sometimes when we bring them in, like we just picked up a 38 we picked up 38 panels, which were essentially 3 murals. And this mural had been up on a building in Northeast since June of last year. It was just taken down, so you can imagine the condition that it's in. But what we found was something we had never seen before, which is that there was an entire ecosystem living on the back of the boards. Um, and so I texted Melissa and was like, "You're really going to have your hands full with this one." Because I mean, there was a wasp nest, there was fungi, mushrooms. I've never seen anything like it. But Melissa comes into the space and she'll assess the condition, and then she'll kill the mold. She'll clean the boards. If there is damage to the plywood where it's kind of flaking off or separating, she'll glue it back down and then kind of iron it back together. We have several panels that have paper glued to them. She'll sometimes fix the paper back to the mural and things like that. She's been a huge help to us. She's given great advice on whether or not we should try to cover the boards in like a form of gesso or something like that. Um, Gosh, most of them wouldn't have survived without her expertise. I mean, for one thing, the first moldy board that we brought into the space, we were going to just put it in the room with the other boards. And she yelled at us and was like, "Don't do that because it'll infect all the other boards." And so she's been, one of the most valuable team members to MTM just because she's helped us keep the boards relatively alive, so to speak, over the last year and a half. But we've also worked with staff members from the Minnesota Historical Society. Um, We've worked with staff from MIA and a couple other smaller preservation organizations around the Twin Cities who have, again, offered their skills and resources to helping us archive. It's been a really difficult process because we didn't know to number the boards or record any metadata about the boards when we first collected them. And so we've had to go through and get all of that data after the fact and then find a way to make a catalog, or right now we're using a spreadsheet, but we're switching over to collective access soon. And we've been kind of creating this catalog of information based on things that we may no longer know. And so that's been a really difficult process, but I've had a lot of help with that. And people are actually starting to reach out who aren't a part of those organizations or institutions. Like I have a student from Howard University who reached out because she wants to learn to archive and she wants to do it with a Black preservation organization. And so now my team here in Minneapolis works with her and we're teaching her how to archive, and she's going to kind of take up the reins hopefully one day and continue this for us. And I've had people reach out who work at universities or colleges here who work in preserving or who teach like our preservation classes, who have reached out to help us out, lend their resources. We worked for a while with the University of St. Thomas's urban art mapping team. They were cataloging everything with images, and so they helped us photograph all of the murals that we have, and then they kind of donated that archive of photos to us for our own archive, which was really, really nice of them and very helpful. And now we're working with an organization called Minnesota Transform, who's with the U of M, and they received a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and they've been kind of re-granting some of those funds to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led nonprofit organizations who need resources and funding. And so they actually just helped us hire an artist liaison, which is huge because we needed someone who was an artist or who is an artist who can connect with the artists and locate them, get consent to use the murals, who can run programming with them and kind of connect, because I'm just doing a million gazillion things. And unfortunately, that's that's an area where I lag because I don't have an in with the artist community really. So they were really super helpful in helping us hire the artist liaison, and Loyola is a wonderful addition to the MTM team. We've just received so much support. I mean, even through the George Floyd Global Memorial with Janelle Austin, and Miss Angela and the team over there, we've had a wonderful kind of relationship where they support the work that we're doing and then we support the work that they're doing, since it's kind of one in the same vein of preservation and this kind of these protest artifacts that are being preserved. And so we are never lacking for great community and resources, which is a huge blessing. But we still need a lot. For one thing, we need funding. We are no different than any other Black nonprofit organization. We're overworked and underfunded, and trying to pay the rent and keep the space and find a larger space, because our current space is 1,100 square feet, but we've kind of done the math and we need something that's max or at least 5,000 square feet in order to store the murals in a way that won't do more damage than good, which is what they're currently doing. They're stacked up, like I said, like a deck of cards. And so it's great because they're upright and so they're not warping, but it's not great because the murals at the back of the stack are taking a lot of stress and tension. So we need a better way to do that. But with the space that we currently have, we don't really have a lot of options. So we are raising funds for a permanent space, or at least a semi-permanent space where the murals again can be on display. We don't want to just store them. We want people to be able to come and see them and interact with them. And so we need a larger space in order to do that. And we need staff. For one entire year, it was just me. And for 6 months out of that year, I was unpaid. And then through a small grant that I got through the Minneapolis Foundation, I was able to pay myself a salary that should last about 6 months. So I'm just at the end of that and looking for funding. And then, like I said, Minnesota Transform was generous enough to pay for Loyola's salary for 6 months. But we did also hire a volunteer coordinator. And unfortunately, we only have her for about 10 weeks because we need more funding in order to be able to sustain her in this work as well. And we really need it's a growing team and we need a lot of help. It takes a lot. When I said that we started collecting so fast, we have over 950 mural boards now, which is probably somewhere around 500 or 600 murals when you think about the panels in each mural. And so it's a lot of work. And we're still cataloging, we're still archiving, we're still activating. This summer we did 6 events, and we have 2 more events happening this fall. And then I think we're going to be participating in an exhibit with Georgia Floyd as well in the fall. So lots and lots of needs.
Well, Lisa, I have to unfortunately transition to an important meeting. But before I go, I just want to again thank you for your leadership and all that you are contributing in memory of George Floyd and also of the BLM protest movement of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
I want to leave you with a couple of things. I think you would compete very well for a Mellon Foundation Humanities in Place grant, and I have great connections there. I would love to make an introduction to the head of that program.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so let's talk offline. I also would love to see a proposal to my program, the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, in December. We can talk about that. And then lastly, I want to provide some technical assistance to you because I understand your vision, but also the difficulty of realizing that in a financially sustainable and structured way. It's going to help you realize the bigger vision, not only for the city and the state, but also for the nation and the world. So let's connect sometime in the next couple of weeks and we can dig into your vision and help define some strategy that helps to move you forward in the short term. But again, I think what you are doing is important, and it's exciting that the next generation is stepping up to lead. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Brent, for joining us.
Cool.
Take care.
I want to encourage the audience to post questions that you might have for Leesa in the chat, and I can read them to her and to the audience. Leesa, speaking earlier, you mentioned that through viewing the boards, you want people to understand, in a sense, what it's like to be you as a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
You want them to get it. This is a really hard question. It's a question I ask myself as somebody who creates exhibits. How do you know when people get it? And when they get it, what do you want them to go do? What do you hope they go do?
Ooh, that is a tough question. I think obviously there's no textbook telltale sign of when someone understands, but usually it's their body's response. Sometimes it's what they say to you when they come up. When they come up to you, you know, it can be tears, it can be anger. I have had people come up to me and just like express this great anger that they feel over what they've seen or what they've experienced. And I'm like, okay, good, you're mad. What are you going to do with that? um, but it ranges, it varies from person to person. And the responses will always be different based on someone's lived experiences. But what I hope that they do with what they've found within themselves after volunteering or, you know, interacting with the murals or whatever they do is I hope that they go at least and talk to the people around them. You don't know how many people, and I will say specifically here in Minnesota, all over the country, sure, I have tons of friends everywhere, but specifically here in Minnesota, I've lived here since 2017, and I cannot tell you the number of people who I know who are white, who are allies, who know and are completely aware of a racist family member. And my goal, my hope for them is that they will go home and they will say something. Like, yes, it is okay to love this family member because that it's family. You can't help but to love your family. And you may not be able to change their mind, but you need to speak up when you hear racism, when you see racism, when you experience racism, you have to speak up. And it's not up to Black and brown people. You know, in the same way that I'm a stewardess of the boards and the murals, I'm also a stewardess of this movement. I don't own this movement. I can't control the outcome as a Black woman because by and large, the system that was created to oppress me won't listen to what I have to say. There are good people who work within that system who will hear me, but it's up to those people to then go to their higher ups and to infiltrate the system and change it from within. Black people can't be the change that this country needs because we didn't do the oppressing. It's the oppressors who have to change themselves. And I say oppressors loosely because that includes the allies. As long as you work and operate and profit off of the system in any way, then it's up to you to do the work to break this down and help us start over. We can build something new. We can give you the tools. We can educate you, but we can't do the thing, you know? And so my hope is that when people start to understand what it's like, when they get to that crossroads of like no going back, of ignorance and awakening, and they choose awakening, that they will start to do the work to dismantle this oppressive system and kind of open the doors for Black and Indigenous and brown people to finally be able to live and thrive in this country.
Really powerful insight. Thank you, Leesa.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the question in the chat from Marcus Young. I can read it to you if you like.
Yes, please. I don't think I can see the chat.
Sure. Marcus Young asks, I had a question for Leesa. Would you consider yourself an empath? I get the sense you're a spiritual person. The part you brought up about having people carry the murals reminds me biblically of carrying your cross, bearing whatever that might be.
Mm. That's a good question. I would consider myself an empath. I do think that the murals are alive. I've said that a lot because, the emotions that people felt were so strong and so intense, and they needed to expel those emotions in order to live their lives, just operate and function normally on a day-to-day basis. And I think that leaving those emotions on the murals somehow carried a piece of them and carried those emotions onto the murals. And now they're affixed there, they live there. And so I do think that when I'm in the space and when I'm interacting with the boards, I'm kind of feeding off their energy and they're feeding off of mine. There was this one time when I was doing an interview in our space at Northrop, and it was just after Dante Wright was killed. And the interviewers were asking me all of these questions about Memorialize, the movement. And then at the end, they said, "How do you feel about Dante Wright's death?" And I just got choked up because I was kind of like, why would you ask me this? But then I just felt this energy in the space. I felt the spirit of the boards, and they kind of just gave me the strength to find my voice and say what I was really feeling, was that I was so angry. And I don't know, it was a news interview, so you can probably find it online somewhere. But when you hear me express how angry I was, there was just so much emotion. It was like it wasn't even coming just from me. There was so much that was built up, and I was letting out not only what I was feeling, but the feelings of so many others before me. And so I would say that I'm an empath. I think so. I've always been really in tune to other people's feelings and emotions. And in particular, as it pertains to this movement, I find myself really empathizing, sorry, with allies, because I know how hard it can be to take that step from ignorance to awakening, so to speak. And I don't envy you all the task of having to choose to let go of your old lives and choose this life of fighting for others, even if it means that you lose family and you lose friends and your worldview changes in an irreparable way. I don't envy you that, but I guess I'll just say that I'm deeply, deeply grateful for it all the same.
Leesa, I wonder what has been the response from some artists that you've been in touch with, what you might have in your collection.
Yeah, it's been a mixed response. There are a lot of artists who are very happy to know that their murals are being preserved and cared for and are being activated as part of history, and the stories are being told and retold. And my relationship that I kind of have with them is that they're the scribes. They recorded the history in real time. They're the brave soldiers who wrote down what was happening as it was happening, including their feelings and emotions, which is a really vulnerable thing to do. And I'm the archivist. I make sure that their stories don't go untold. And that's a really healthy relationship that we have. And there are others who think that the work was never meant to be preserved. There are those who think that the work should have just kind of dissolved or been destroyed after it was taken down, that it wasn't meant to live on. And to those people, I understand. I understand those feelings. I understand where they're coming from, certainly, because it was a really vulnerable time for them. The people who made these weren't thinking about these complex emotions being preserved and viewed by the world. They just had something to say, and they never assumed. It's like when you write your emotions on a piece of paper and then burn the piece of paper. They never assumed that these really vulnerable emotions would suddenly become the focus of this movement. And I get that, but at the same time, we need this to create understanding. We need this to keep the story going. And so for some people, they've chosen to take their murals back and kind of keep them private, which is understandable and completely respectable. And there are others who have said, I don't like it, but I trust that you know what you're doing. And they've decided to entrust us anyway. But it really has been a mixed response. And I think the main thing is that with artists, they just want to feel valued and seen because this work is so vulnerable and so personal to them. And so that's why I made the push to hire an artist liaison, is because I wanted there to be one designated person whose only job it was to empathize with the artists and make sure that they were understood and that their wishes were acknowledged.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, I wonder, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that you were both suspicious of white-led institutions or institutions traditionally associated with collecting things of significance to communities who haven't done as much as perhaps they should have done or should be doing to collect a more diverse narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could say more about why representation matters in this context. Why people who work for and lead organizations who might seek to do historic preservation work or archiving or collecting, why identity and representation matters in that context.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad you brought that up. Excuse me. It all has to do with how the story gets told. I don't think that MIA or the Walker or Hennepin History Museum or the Minnesota Historical Society are bad organizations. They've been our keepers and our preservers and our conservationists up until this point, and you have to give them their credit for that, because we didn't have a way to do it ourselves. We didn't have resources, but also that's just the point. We didn't have resources. Historically in this country, with museums and preservation institutions, it's just kind of automatically fallen on white people to preserve history. And I think the issue that I have, the suspicion, is that we were never asked whether or not we want to preserve our own history. We were never asked how our history should be preserved. I mean, if you think about DC and all of the beautiful and wonderful Smithsonian museums we have there, why was it only until 2017 that we got a Black History Museum that's just dedicated to our history and our history alone? That's way too little too late. So much has already been lost because we didn't have the funding and resources to preserve what we thought was important. And I think that's the other point, is that when you're not in, when a specific race or culture is not in charge of their own history, then we don't get to pick and choose what becomes important. Like Tulsa, for example. Now that I know about Tulsa, and there's so many like me, I'm 28, I'll be 29 this year. I didn't learn about it until last year. And there's so many like me who also are just learning about what happened in Tulsa. There's so many who don't know that Minneapolis had a Black Wall Street, who just weren't aware of these things because these white institutions, for all of the good that they've done, didn't think that it was necessary to talk about the fact that we had Black spaces that were just for us, that we had created and where we were thriving and had built our own economy, and had those snatched from us and taken away from us so that we can be participants or slaves, if you will, to this capitalist system that we don't benefit from at all. That's history that I would have liked to have learned. And that option to learn it was taken from me. And so I think that while there is merit to these institutions, right now the best thing they can do is to just stop, is to step aside. And they know that they have the privilege and they have the resources, and so they should take those resources and help us build our own institutions, our own systems, our own museums, because that's the only way we're going to move forward. We can't move forward as a country if we can't acknowledge the ugly things that have happened. And as much as these institutions may even want to, they'll never be able to acknowledge what happened to George Floyd in the way that I could, or my team of people could. And so it's not up to them to do that. It's up to us, and it's up to them to then bring people in and encourage them to learn from that, what we teach them. But there's just so many complexities about these institutions that are in place. And it's sad because, growing up, I've always been a museum girl. I've always loved art institutions and galleries and museums, and I still do. But I am now also seeing the ugly side of it, and the fact that museums and art institutions contribute to this oppressive system just as much as any other business or organization. And you have to change the system if it's not working for you.
Thank you. We talk a lot in the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota about working within systems to change them, working outside of systems to change them, to do heritage work in a different way than it's been done in the past. You spoke, you've spoken throughout this presentation about not being trained to be an archivist or a conservationist or a preservationist. But it strikes me in listening to you that you seem exceptionally well prepared to do this work. And so I wonder, as you look back on your own history, what has prepared you to do this work, to be so articulate about and so passionate about this story, these murals, and connecting with people to preserve them? How did you get here?
That's a great question. I'm still discovering that. I'm still reflecting. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to therapy and I'm trying to find out how I got here as well. I went to school, I went to Western Michigan University for tourism. Um, and my minor was global studies. And so nothing I learned in school prepared me for this largely. And after that, I worked in financial aid for higher education institutions. And so when I stepped into this, honestly, I became a different person. I became someone that I don't entirely recognize or understand. Um, and what I've learned is that I have a passion for this. I was made to do this. I love the work that I do now, even though it's hard and it's heavy. I found my passion in preservation and conservation. I found a love that I never knew that I needed. Um, but to answer your question, I don't know. I'm still learning. I didn't know that I could speak. I've always been really shy to public speaking, and I've never really enjoyed being the spotlight of anything, which is still true. I hate being the face of Memorialize the movement. But the this work has opened up a new side of me, a version of myself that I never knew existed. And now I find myself public speaking often and, speaking at conferences like this more than I ever imagined that I would in my life. And I've spoken, wow. I've spoken at universities, and it's been a journey of self discovery as well as a journey to grow an organization from nothing. And it's been really interesting. And I think maybe for me, that's kind of the most complicated part of all of this is figuring out who I am as I figure out who the organization is and who we want to be. Um, but I think if there's one thing that I've kind of discovered in this work is that you don't need a formal education or a lot of experience when to do work like this, because and I know that to an extent you need some education, you need some understanding of how to do the work, but I think that can also be a barrier, to people getting into this field. You just have to want to learn. And so, the student who reached out to me from Howard, Meng Yang, she is not in the preservation or conservation field of study. She's in a totally different field of study. I think she's studying like music or something. But she wanted to know how to do this work so that she can apply it to her degree. And instead of taking more classes and, trying to learn the formal way, she reached out to me and was like, I saw you do it. Teach me. And that was probably the most gratifying moment in my, I guess you can call this my career thus far, is this young Black woman from Howard seeing me jump into this work with no experience and being like, well, if she can do it, I can do it. Because that's what I wanted. If nothing else, that's what I want young Black and brown women to take away from this, is that you can do it. If you're passionate enough about seeing change in your community, then you can do it. You just have to have the drive. You just have to have the willpower to keep going when it gets hard, because it does get hard. But I don't I don't know what prepared me for this. I just saw a need and jumped into it.
It's very inspirational, and I can well imagine that there will be others who are looking to you and saying, I can do that too. And I'm getting little messages in the chat that you might not be able to see, Leesa, of people who are really just very appreciative and inspiring of the work that you've been doing.
Thank you.
One last messy question. I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, Leesa, but I imagine it's on the minds of a lot of people who are listening into this session, who many, perhaps most, I would imagine, are white like me. And they often hear preservationists say, like, well, we would like to preserve more historic sites of significance to people of color, to Indigenous people, but we don't know what those sites are. And we don't know who the Black preservationists are. What message would you send? What advice would you have to, because most of the people listening in are, they have an interest in, or they have experience in, they work in the field of historic preservation, which has traditionally been defined as the preservation of buildings and landscapes and large objects in the landscape. And I wonder if your work has, opportunities for people to observe a different kind of preservation, and maybe even to move towards the preservation that they're more oriented towards, which is to say, again, the preservation of historic sites, landscapes. That question makes sense?
That's a hard question, but a good question. I'll try and answer that. I think, so the first part of that question is that they don't know what to preserve, or, where the Black preservationists are. And there's a very simple answer for that. They don't know what to preserve because it's probably not for them. So the answer is, don't try and preserve it. But instead, there are organizations out there that are Black and BIPOC led. Reach out to those organizations. Tell them what you want to do, and then see if they're interested in helping you do that, or taking the reins while you help them do that. Minnesota Transform, I mentioned earlier, they're helping us now, and we've got this great partnership where they're providing us with a ton of resources. And when we had our first meeting, one of the staff from Minnesota Transform was like, yeah, we saw the murals coming down, and we had a meeting and talked about whether or not we should preserve them. But then we saw an article where you said not to, so we didn't. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that someone listened. But essentially, there's a ton of organizations out there. It may not seem like it because they're not well known, such as Memorialize the movement, and they may be smaller and underfunded, and maybe not very well organized, like Memorialize the movement. But we're out here, and we're really trying to make a real effort to make change in our communities. And so do some research and find organizations like mine, because we want to help. We want to do this work, but we don't have the same resources that you have. And then as far as there not being enough preservationists, yeah, I'm also seeing that. I mean, I wasn't a preservationist, and I had to become one in order to do this work, because I didn't even know that there was a field called preservation at my school. I'm still not sure because I never saw it, or saw anyone, or met anyone who was going for museum preservation or conservation. I was not even aware that this was a field. I don't know who I assume ran museums. Um, but that's something we can work on together. And by together, I mean, this is something that these organizations and institutions can do without the help of Black and BIPOC people. You can have an internship program for students of color where you bring them in and teach them how to do this work and have them help you and learn. You can have a scholarship program that's just for Black people for preservation or conservation or any sort of historical work. Those are things that you can do to bring in more of us, because we don't know about these things until we see it somewhere or someone tells us. When I started this, I didn't realize it was preservation. I thought I was just doing activism. you know,
Yeah.
you know, like
Yeah.
I found the language along the way, which has been great because now I sound like I know what I'm talking about. But I didn't know at first what this was. I had to learn what it was. And so it would be nice to see like the Minnesota Historical Society or an organization like that have a scholarship specifically for students of color to learn to do this work or to go to school for this work. But the second half of that question is a lot it's a lot messier because it is hard to determine what is historical artifact. I mean, technically anything can be. You know, there's a museum called the Morrison County Historical Society, and I think MNHS is kind of the same, where it's just like an old man's shoes and like a hat from the 1930s, and that's considered history. So technically speaking, all of it is historical artifact and site and what have you. But I think it's up to us to determine what should be saved and preserved. Like for me, if someone asked me right now, what's the most important historical site in Minneapolis, I'm going to say George Floyd Square, because there's so much there. There's so much history. There's so much culture. There's a story there that needs to be preserved for generations to come. But the city doesn't see it that way. So it'll be destroyed if someone doesn't decide to do something about it.
Well, Leesa, we're out of time. I want to end there. Thank you just so much for doing this work. Been just an astonishingly articulate spokesperson for this work.
Thank you. I feel like I really was jumbled all over the place.
Oh gosh, no, you are a gifted public speaker, let me assure you. So thanks so much for this. If you don't know how to connect with Brent Legs, I'll send you a follow-up email. I think I have his email address. And if
Yes,
I can help you with some of these Mellon grants, my colleagues and I at the university and Minnesota Transform, we're there to help.
Thank you. That would be incredible.
Yeah, it's the least we can do, literally. Thanks again, and thanks everybody for your interest and for tuning into this. Take care, Leesa. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Okay, should I leave?